Kateryna Protsenko is already in the room. Welcome, Kateryna. It's such a joy to have you
Hi,
here.
thank you.
So, Kateryna is a teacher trainer, an author, and she's based in Kiev. And she'll talk today about how to give feedback that empowers those who receive this feedback. So, over to you, Kateryna, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks very much, Federica, for such a lovely introduction, and thank you for having me here today. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to everyone about feedback. It's such a lovely topic. And thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar today. Thank you for finding this hour. I know we're very, very busy teaching online these days, and we have so many classes going on. And spending an extra hour in front of your computer doing even more work. I'm amazed and I'm impressed. Thank you. So I'm just going to start by talking about who this person is and why she's talking about feedback. So when I was thinking about the topic for the webinar, I thought that feedback is such an important aspect of learning that we just can't avoid talking about it, whatever we do. And I work on Celta and Delta courses here at Grade in Kiev, and also on a lot of other courses abroad. And as you may know, that feedback is an integral part of those courses, and I have to give feedback on a day-to-day basis, including simple observations of the teachers who work here. But that's not the reason why I chose to talk about feedback. The reason is that I myself have received feedback on so many occasions in life. I've counted and I've taken 11 professional development courses, which entailed receiving feedback on my lessons or on my performance or written work. And feedback has been different. It has been positive, negative, helpful, not very helpful. But I've learned a lot from every single piece of feedback I've received. And so here I am talking about feedback today. When I was preparing for this and actually just reading for pleasure, I came across this lovely book by Anders Ericsson. That's Peak. And by the way, you're going to get links to all the books and all the websites which I used when preparing for this webinar. Everything is going to be on the final slide. So don't worry about the links, and you will also receive my slides along with the certificate. So back to the book. In his book, Peak, Anders Ericsson talks about how novices become professionals and how we learn to be professionals. And there's been a lot of research which has shown that a person needs 10,000 hours of repetition or practice, which will take them to the level of professionals. And they've observed chess players, tennis players, cello players. And there's been a particular aspect of the research in which they looked at 13 musicians who were training to be professionals. And the big difference is that those who did not end up being really good musicians had received around 6,000 hours of practice, while those who did become really good musicians trained for around 10,000 hours. But there's a slight difference, or a big difference, between those who were able to produce masterpieces and those who were not. And that's feedback. Getting trained for 10,000 hours or practicing for 10,000 hours and practicing for 10,000 hours and receiving feedback, those are two very, very different things. And feedback can take lots of different forms, and feedback is everywhere around us. Actually, we see it and we get it every day. This is feedback. Obviously, this is an example of a test which we grade. We give an A, B, C, D, whatever other grade we give, and say this is right and this is wrong. And this is also an example of feedback. This is actually one of my colleagues here in Kiev. And his students were doing a simple speaking activity, a pair discussion. And so he was making notes of what the students were saying. And then here in this picture, he's written a sentence and is just giving synonyms to a word which he didn't really like. And here is another example of feedback. That's a simple post-it note left on a laptop saying, "Good job, well done." It's just a piece of encouragement, but also feedback, which says, "Well done, that's something good." And this is also feedback. When we see our students who look happy, who are smiling and with their hand up, we know that they're enjoying what we're doing and they're probably learning. And that's their feedback to us. That's them saying, "Thank you, teacher." So feedback is everywhere, but what is it officially? What is it in an English language learning classroom? And I've taken this definition from the new A to Z of ELT, and Thornbury says that feedback is the information, can be either immediate or delayed, that learners get on their performance. And that's in terms of the English language learning. But if we think about feedback in a broader sense, here, the dictionary definition says that feedback is comments about how well or how badly someone is doing something, and those comments are intended to help them to do it better. I would also like to add here that those comments are intended to motivate this person to perform better, but that's something we're going to talk about later. When scrolling down the online dictionary, I saw this lovely note about feedback, which says that, you'll see it here, feedback is the high loud noise that electrical equipment makes when part of the sound that it sends out goes back in. So if you imagine a microphone and you're speaking into the microphone, and then suddenly from this loudspeaker you can hear this squeaky noise, which says that's the signal which goes in and then out. So yeah, feedback is a way to say that's what's happening. And over to you now. I'd like to know what kind of feedback you have received in life and how you like to receive feedback. You have those two questions on my slide. I'd like to ask you to type the answers into the chat box. What different kinds of feedback have you received in life? And how do you like to receive feedback? There will be different answers. I can already see some things like performance evaluation, grades, written, spoken, encouraging. Yes, very nice. Formative and summative, lovely. So I can see some good terminology here. Constructive, that's what we're going to talk about today. Great. Appreciation, motivation. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Good. Happy eyes. I like that. I really like that. So feedback is not only somebody saying, yes, well done. Yeah, it's a lot of other things, a lot of other different aspects. Demotivating sometimes. Sorry to hear that. So we're going to speak about how not to do that. Okay, so when I was thinking about feedback, I wanted to classify it so that we cover some aspects which are more or less organized. And here is what I've come up with. You can see that feedback can be verbal and non-verbal, and verbal being something which arrives in words, and then non-verbal is, I think you mentioned some of those things like smiles, gestures, body language, and things like that. And feedback can be positive and negative. Obviously, we've all received both kinds of feedback, and we're going to briefly touch on that as well and why it matters. And written and oral, of course. And if we speak about feedback in an English language learning classroom, that will be feedback on form. and feedback on content. We sometimes call feedback on form, feedback on language. And the other thing I want to cover today is feeding back and feeding forward and the difference in how to do those things. There's one more important aspect to feedback, and that's feedback being constructive and counterproductive. And I think it really matters how we do feedback, how we give feedback, and there's a lot we can do for it to be constructive, even when it's negative and even when it's not very motivating. Okay, so we're going to start from talking about verbal and non-verbal feedback. And it's easy to think about that. We often say good, well done, good job, and other things, both in a face-to-face classroom and in an online classroom. But in an online classroom, it's particularly difficult to make sure the students really understand what we mean by our words. Like if you think about it, imagine you're texting your friend. And when you text, it's really difficult to read your intonation. So sometimes people get the message wrong. And same happens in an online classroom. The students are looking at us, they're trying to see what we actually mean, but it's not always possible. So these days, it's particularly important to pay very, very good attention to nonverbal signals we're sending to our students. So facial expressions, for instance, things like smiling, obviously a very important thing. There are other things which we might not notice, but which happen on quite a lot of occasions. Things like rolling our eyes. And it happened to me on a few occasions when I was training the other trainers, when, you know, we're giving positive feedback, we're listening to questions, but we occasionally roll our eyes without actually intending it. And it sends the signal that, you know, we think the question is not very interesting or not very smart. So we need to make sure that we are consistent in what we're saying and what we're showing. And tone and pitch of voice, of course, also very important, because one simple word good can sound very positive if we say, oh, good, good, and can sound very confusing if we say, ah, oh, good. So we have to be very careful with that as well. And body language and our gestures can show a lot. You can see I'm gesturing here. And if we have open gestures, it shows that we are open to the students and we want to give a lot, as opposed to, you know, sitting like this in a closed position and not being very open to what's happening. By the way, those signals are the signals we get from our students as well. If we see that they're smiling or they're gesturing, it probably means they're more relaxed. Silence is another example of feedback, and it can often be misinterpreted. And I often see teachers who are afraid of silence in the classroom. Silence can mean that our students aren't listening, or it could mean that they're not with us, they don't understand what we're talking about. But it can also mean that they need a little bit more time to process what we're saying. And it could potentially mean that, you know, they're just getting ready to answer. So we need to see what the body language is telling us as well. What makes it particularly difficult is the fact that we are on camera all the time. So when we're teaching, and particularly when we give feedback to our students, we actually see ourselves. And this is like being on stage, but seeing yourself. And we want to make sure that, you know, we look good to our students and they like us. And our attention can shift a little bit. And social distancing is another important aspect. When we are in the classroom, we can simply come up to the students and show that we are listening and say a couple of words individually, which is very difficult in an online classroom. So when speaking to the teachers here at our language center, we often say that please make sure that you nominate the students a lot, because in a face-to-face classroom, you simply come up to somebody and they know that you're there and they know that you're paying attention to them. While in an online classroom, it's very difficult. They don't see where you're looking, and they don't know that you're listening or how you're listening if they're in breakout rooms. So we need to nominate more in an online classroom to make sure the students know we are with them. And finally, I've been reading up on why video chats and online lessons are so exhausting, because they are. I feel they're so difficult. There's this concept of all eggs being in one cognitive basket. And imagine at the moment, everything we do happens in an online classroom, in this online environment. But if we think back to our real classroom, if you picture your classroom for a moment and imagine you're back there with your favorite students, you're teaching a lesson in the morning, and then in the afternoon, your boss and your colleagues come in and you have a meeting, you have a business meeting there, planning the year or employment or some other things. And so you're not a teacher, you're more like an employee, a manager, whatever it is, an admin staff or whatever it is. And then in the evening, you're still in the same classroom, but already having a pizza party with your friends. That's a little weird. And that kind of shifts a lot of focus. It's very difficult to switch from being a person to being a teacher, and then to being a person or an employee. So we need to spend a couple of minutes preparing for what we're going to do, and thinking about what we want to pay a lot of attention to in this online environment. And if we can relax a little bit and look into lots of various places when we're having a meeting with our friends, if it's something social, we have to be particularly careful to make sure we're with the students in the lesson, because this is our nonverbal feedback to them. Why is this important? I've done a little bit of research into that, and you can see a link to a lovely article which says that delays on phone or conferencing systems, slight delays of 1.2 seconds, make people perceive the responder as less friendly or less focused. And that kind of kills it. It kills the rapport we want to establish with the students. So if you think about it, we say something, or our students say something, and it takes us 1.2, it takes it 1.2 seconds to arrive to us, into our ears. And then we react to that and we respond, but it takes 1.2 seconds for it to arrive to enter the student's ears. So that's about 3 seconds already. 3 seconds of silence, a little bit awkward. And there's a lot of evidence that it kind of makes the students feel left out, and we need to be very careful with that. So a lot of people will argue that, paying a lot of attention to body language and smiling and being overly positive and encouraging can be counterproductive and shouldn't be done, especially if you're a young learners teacher. And a lot of my young learners teachers will argue with me and say, no, we don't do that. There's this lovely concept of no smile until Christmas, where we say that we should be entering the classroom in September, being very strict, poker face, and trying to keep good classroom management. And then gradually we relax and start smiling. I don't think that's true, unfortunately. It doesn't really help us establish the rapport with the students. And again, maybe it's just my brain that looks for evidence of the things I like, but there's a lot of reading and a lot of videos which prove that we need to be very positive with our students to win them And this TED Talk, which I particularly like, it's by Rita Pearson, who talks about kids who need their heroes. And she says her main point is that kids don't learn from the people they don't like. And there's a lot of evidence for that. In psychology, we say that when we meet a person who we like, we start acting like this person. So we might pick up some gestures from them. Our gestures will change. Music is another example. We start listening to the music they like. And also we pick up some words from them because we want to, lessen this social distance. And the same thing happens in class. When the students really like their teachers, they start acting like their teachers. They pick up the gestures, they want to read the same books, and they pick up the language from the teacher. It doesn't necessarily have to be something we're teaching. So if we're teaching present continuous, that's our input, but that will not necessarily be the student's intake. They might pick up a fancy word, an interesting gesture. They might pick up part of the instructions we give on how to do a task. And this is their feedback to us. If we see that they start acting the way we do, it means that they've relaxed, they like us, and they are learning, even unintentionally sometimes. So the point I'm making here is it's very, very important to stay positive and give positive feedback. We have to be sensible, of course, and in the previous webinar, I saw a couple of comments of people saying negative feedback is also very important. It is, and at the end of this webinar, we're going to see some examples of some very good negative feedback. But why? Why do we need to stay positive? And that's a question about psychology, but also about our biology. In terms of psychology, there's this common belief that our brain doesn't accept the particle not. So when we say don't touch it, our brain automatically hears touch it. I don't know how it works and whether that's true. But in terms of biology, there's a way in which our brain functions when we receive feedback. So if we think about our students and imagine a situation, we've assigned a piece of writing for homework, and our students have done this writing, that they put in a lot of effort really, and they bring it in and they give it to us and say, teacher, here it is. And you say, oh, great, I'm going to mark it and I'll give it back to you in a week or so. And then what happens in our brain is it thinks, okay, task done, forget it. So they close the cell and we just forget about it. The point is that we can do it in a different way. So if a student brings in the homework we want to grade, and we take a couple of minutes to look at it, a couple of seconds even, to look at it, to say, oh, here is a nice word you used. Here is something from our previous lesson. Oh, that's a nice structure. Oh, that's such a long piece of writing. Really good handwriting, or whatever other feedback we want to give. The student's brain immediately receives dopamine. And that's a little bit of chemistry there for you. So our brains receive dopamine when we receive immediate feedback on our performance. So when we do that, and we know that dopamine is responsible for feeling of happiness, motivation, and desire to work, we basically motivate our students to do even more work and to do even more writing. So if you ever think that your students don't really like writing, think back to this moment and try giving a little bit of immediate feedback and see maybe it motivates the students to do that a little bit more. Let's think further and think about a student who didn't perform very well. They tried very hard and say they are pre-intermediate and they've given us a piece of writing, an essay, with a lot of mistakes. they've attempted the third conditional, they've attempted a variety of future forms with a lot of other things, but with mistakes. And so they get this feedback, they get this immediate feedback. Oh, great, well done. But they also see that we see their mistakes. This is when we have to be very careful, because this lovely second sign from chemistry is cortisol, which is the hormone for stress. So what happens is when we get negative feedback, we receive a lot of cortisol. And so the two hormones are there in our body playing around, and our brain basically goes crazy thinking, what should I do? What should I do? And cortisol is stronger, if you like, a stronger hormone. So it kind of kills the whole dopamine game. Dangerous. So the point is that when giving immediate feedback, we need to try and stay positive. We do need to point out the mistakes, but we need to do that in very careful words, so that I can see a lovely comment in the chat that mistakes are the ladder to success. And I totally agree with this, and I'm happy I see this comment there, but we need to teach our students that that's the case. And at the end of this webinar, I'm going to show you some specific examples of feedback which can teach our students that mistakes are good, and that we need to make mistakes, and how to work with that. So is it all about biology? Basically, yes. When we teach, we work with human beings, and we're all comprised of cells and hormones and neurons and other things. And every single word we say has a lot of impact on us in terms of psychology, but also in terms of biology. So if we move on to the next point, we'll talk about feedback on form, or feedback on language, if you like, and also feedback on content. So I'm going to show you some examples of feedback, and I'd like you to think about the point, whether that's feedback on content or that's feedback on language. And I'll just do one example with you. So number one, the teacher asks learners whether they agreed with each other in a discussion about the benefits of the internet. Here we're more interested in what they spoke about rather than how they did that. So that's an example of feedback on content. So take a couple of minutes, and I'd like you to write your answers into the chat, please. So C for content and L for language. And you can simply do 1C, 2L, 3L, whatever you think. And I'll be watching. I'll just look at your answers, and we'll later discuss them together. And I'm just going to get a sip of water because I've been speaking all this time. Okay, I can see some people commenting. 1 content, 2 content, 3 content. Okay. Right. Good. All right, we're still on numbers 1, 2, 3. I can already see some people commenting on 4, 5, and you're saying that's language. Okay. There was a question about CLIL. No, I don't mean CLIL course. I mean any kind of English language teaching. So when we set the task, there are different aspects to the task. There is the content, there is what we're talking about. So that can be the internet, that can be what we did yesterday, and so on. And that can be language. That's the language we use to perform this task. And let me just show you the answers I have. All right. So the first 3 examples are feedback on content, and the other 5 examples are feedback on language. So in number 2, for example, when we ask our learners how many people they spoke to in a mingling activity, we're not asking them about the grammar or vocabulary or pronunciation or the functional language they use to perform there to do this activity. We're simply asking them, how many people have you interacted with? And in number 3, the teacher tells the learners that she really enjoyed reading their essays. And that's also feedback on content. That says, well done, a good attempt. Your essay is interesting. We're not responding to the mistakes, and there can be a lot of mistakes, but we still enjoyed reading that. I can see some questions in the chat, and I'm going to answer all of your questions, or most of your questions, at the end of this webinar. But the things I saw an interesting point. Should we be balanced? Should we be trying to find some balance between feedback on content and feedback on language? And the answer is yes. We should always attempt to give both feedback on content and feedback on language, because it's very, very important that learners get both, that they know that we're interested in what they spoke about. If we set the task to speak about the benefits of the internet, wouldn't it be fair to ask the learners what they discussed, what they spoke about? Maybe they have some really interesting points. It's natural to ask the people for their opinion. And so if we look back at the examples on my slide, we have 5 examples of feedback on language. And if you look at numbers 4 and 5, yeah, a handout was answers to gapful exercise and the tense that the teacher has used in her story. Those are obviously examples of, well, number 4 could be an example of vocabulary exercise, but most probably grammar. And 5 is definitely grammar, as well as 6, where we say a sentence in which the learners use the tense incorrectly. While numbers 7 and 8 are examples of feedback on pronunciation, which I have to confess, we often forget about. We tend to focus on grammar so much that we can easily forget that there is also vocabulary, there's also functional language, and there's also pronunciation. And on the CELTA courses I teach, a lot of the trainees say, but my learners, they performed so well, they didn't make any grammar mistakes. And I say, well, it's not all about grammar. Listen to their pronunciation. Maybe they're mispronouncing this sound. Maybe it's w, maybe it's v, maybe it's something else. Listen to that. And there's always this opportunity for a mini drill where we can give our learners 2, 3 minimal pairs and then get them to pronounce the minimal pairs and correct them. And minimal pairs being things like sin and thin, where there's just one little sound differing between the 2 words. And there should be some balance. There should be a variety of things we give feedback on. And it's often possible to upgrade or stretch the student's language. Say we have a speaking activity in which the learners are talking about what they think, and they tend to use I think, I think, I think. And this is when we can give feedback on the functional language they use and give them a lot of other functional exponents for I think, like I guess, I reckon, in my opinion, and stuff like that. One very important point here is that we have to be very, very careful about what we say. Occasionally, in a lot of websites which are not reliable, we can see things like functional exponents which are outdated. An example from the Russian-speaking world is "as for me." We tend to use it for "I think" so much, and that's simply incorrect. So it's best to use a reliable source like a published book or a dictionary by a publishing house where we can find reliable examples. So that's the kind of feedback, or that's the feedback on content and the feedback on language, which we give. I mentioned feedback on form earlier, and that's kind of a narrower definition where, when we teach some grammar or some vocabulary, we tend to focus on meaning, form, and pronunciation. And when I say feedback on form, it comes from that. And that already entails giving feedback on, grammar mostly. So in a narrower sense, that's feedback on form, but in a broader sense, that's definitely feedback on the language we use. Okay, and when we do this online these days. And I often see that in an online classroom, we do this in the same way all the time. We tend, and same in a face-to-face classroom, actually, we tend to say, so what did you and your partner speak about? What did you agree on? What happened? What did you discuss? And what happens to our learners is their brain is prepared for what's going to happen next. One person speaking and then everybody listening. And so our brain just tends to switch off, and we are not following what our learners are saying. And that's particularly difficult in an online classroom because we have to keep them focused and we want their attention all the time. And I've seen a couple of really nice examples of how we can ask our learners, what did you and your partner speak about, in a nice way. So, for example, we can ask the people to put their hand up if they agree with their partner, and then simply ask them to comment on things. A simple way of doing that, a more sophisticated or a more interesting way, is we can ask them to put up a piece of colored paper or a marker of specific color. If they have that, if you prepare them for that and tell them in advance that we're going to use some color markers. And so put up a red marker if the answer is yes, put up a green marker if your answer is no. If we're learning objects like classroom objects with young learners, yeah, we can say put up a pen if it's a yes, put up a ruler if it's a no. Simply ask them to send yes into the chat, which I'm sure we all do. And also, we can ask our learners to switch off their cameras. I've seen that once and it worked really nicely. But I must say we have to be very, very careful here because when we say switch off your cameras, chances are they will never switch them on again. So we have to actually make sure they do that in the end. And we can also ask learners to gesture. So like do this if the answer is yes, or show whatever we want them to show. Show this, like this, whatever. There's lots of different things we can do. I've been reading Facebook posts by different teachers, and I've seen some really nice ideas. One teacher reported that he's observed a lesson in which the students were learning, I think it was the topic was clothes, and so the teacher asked the students to bring their favorite pieces of clothes, and it's easy to do because we're all at home now. So to bring in their favorite pieces of clothes and describe and talk about that. So very, very memorable, and we can also do that in our classrooms. And when we think about feedback on content, and there was this question, how do we balance feedback on content and feedback on language? And that's one other aspect we need to think about. And there's a difference between listening to our students and actually hearing them. And we're going to think about the difference just in a minute, but first I'd like you to look at a dialogue. It's an example of some interaction between a teacher and a student. And there's a problem. The student makes a mistake. But in terms of teaching, in terms of the methodology, what is the problem? So have a look at the dialogue and send your answers into the chat, please. But first, just read what is there. Okay, so linguistically speaking, the problem is had. The student uses have instead of had. But what is the problem with the interaction? What does the teacher do wrong? Or is it wrong? Maybe it's not. Okay. And see, the teacher interrupts, the teacher doesn't explain. And yeah, those are all very fair comments. And what happens in this dialogue is the teacher is not listening to what the student is saying, or rather, the teacher is listening, but the teacher doesn't hear what happens. The interaction starts off as feedback on content, in which we ask the students what they actually spoke about, but then we suddenly interrupt the student, we correct a mistake, and that's already feedback on language. And the student hasn't had enough time to process what just happened, but the teacher goes back to feedback on content and keeps going. So it kind of looks like this. So we start here and we go in a straight line in terms of feedback on content, and we suddenly deviate. And here we are doing feedback on language. And the student has to be here as well. And then the teacher goes back, but the student is still there thinking about the language. And it's very, very important to always make sure we give the students enough time to process what has just happened. And the best idea here would be to finish with feedback on content, listen to the students and react to them in a natural and a humanly natural way, and then do feedback on language. Because what happens in this interaction is the student cries. Possibly the teacher as well, because there's been a lot of misunderstanding and communication breakdown. But yes, the best idea here would be to make a note of the mistake and then do feedback later. Remember, earlier I said that if we receive feedback, our brain sends dopamine, or our body sends dopamine, gets dopamine. Don't know how it works in terms of biology, but there we are with this hormone. But then we know that something is wrong, and then we get cortisol, which is not a very good mixture. So the difference between hearing and listening, where hearing is the process in which we think about ourselves, and listening is the action in which we're focusing on what's being said, and the learners know that we're going to respond. There's this common picture which I see on the internet, and that's basically listening to. I don't remember the way it goes, but it's the distinction between listening because we want to think about what to say, and listening because we really want to listen to our partner or what the person is saying. And there's a big difference, because listening because we want to say something in response is hearing, and listening because we want to listen is the actual act of listening. So many words here. But yeah, as teachers, it's very important for us. And that's another thing which helps us establish the rapport. If we listen to our students and we know that this student has two children, this student is a graphic designer, and this student likes coffee and goes to this particular coffee shop every day, it's nice. It's just humanly nice to know that somebody's interested in our life. And it helps. It really helps with the rapport. And if we move on, there's this point of feeding back and feeding forward, which I also wanted to focus on. And this also comes from electrical engineering, which I mentioned earlier, and the thing about microphones. But feeding back and feeding forward in terms of the English language classroom is talking about what happened and talking about what should happen so that we learn or we progress. So there are three basic questions to feeding forward, and they are: where am I going? How am I doing? And what should I do next? And those are the questions which we ask our students, and our students basically ask themselves and ask us. And feeding forward is doing something or thinking about something before it happens. And some examples could include marking drafts of essays submitted midterm. So say we give our students a project to complete, they have to, for instance, describe their room and draw a picture of their room. And they do a draft and they bring it in, and we see that articles are all over the place and prepositions are missing and some things. And so we can point out a couple of mistakes and correct them, and then give it back, give the project back and get the learners to improve it. And generally speaking, this is what we introduced in our CELTA courses, because we give 4 big written assignments to our trainees. And normally it's, here is your assignment, here is your task, you go work on it, and then you submit it and you get your feedback. But we tend to have those little individual consultation hours or like input sessions dedicated to the questions where we all get together. We've done some work, we've already started, so we know what it's all about. And the candidates ask their questions or show little pieces of things, and we say, okay, this is going in the right direction and this is not, and think about the intonation problems here and blah, blah, blah. And it's been amazing, because in the past, we used to get, 6 written assignments and 5 resubmissions out of 6. While now we're getting fewer and fewer resubmissions because we are able to answer the questions and to point our candidates in the right direction. And that's what we should be. That's what we should be doing with our learners as well. Giving out checklists for tasks is another thing which I really like and I encourage, particularly on Delta. So things like, here is a piece of writing which you need to complete. In order for it to be successful, you need to use this structure, you need to talk about those content points, but also please use those linkers, blah, 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 blah. Use the following grammar, and then just point out the grammar which needs to be used, and then some vocabulary. You can even give specific vocabulary they need to use in the piece of writing. And I know a lot of the people, especially those who've taken CELTA, will disagree with me here and say, if we do writing or if we do freer practice, we should not be telling our learners what language to use. And yes, that's a totally fair point. If we're doing freer practice, we should not be telling them what to use. However, if we want to feed forward, if our aim is to make them use this, then actually we should give them a checklist. We should give them the language we want them to use. And that's my next point, just simply telling the students what language to use. And the other thing which I often encourage is, and I often do, is stopping an activity halfway and doing feedback and feeding forward. So if we hear that, for instance, our learners are talking about something, they're discussing, let's say, places in town, and they're all mispronouncing, or half of them are mispronouncing the word police station. They all say police station. It is totally fine to come up to those learners and correct them at a certain point, or to stop the activity and point out a couple of words which are being mispronounced, because it's the target language. And we all know that there are fossilized errors. And actually, if we repeat the same thing incorrectly, that's where the fossilized errors come from. And if we stop this activity and we correct the mistake and we do just a little bit of drilling, just 2 or 3 times, and then the learners go on, then it might help them be more accurate with that. A lot of people will disagree, and I know why, but it all depends on our aim for the activity. And so let's look back to the pieces of feedback which I showed earlier, in which the first 3 were feedback on content and then the final 5 were feedback on language. So the question is, how would we do that here? How can we feed forward? And it's a little bit difficult with feedback on content because the feedback on content is generally what happened. And in number 2, for instance, when we ask the learners how many people they spoke to in a mingling activity, we can feed forward if we give each learner, let's say, 5 pieces of paper, and every single learner gets those gets pieces of paper of a certain color. So like green for Anna, black for Ivan, red for Manuel, and so on and so forth. So they need to give the little piece of paper to the learners they spoke to. And then in the end, we'll get learners with pieces of paper of different colors, but they all should get rid of their own colors. And that's how we feed forward. That's how we tell them and we control that they actually perform the task. And if we think about the other things, if we think about, let's say number 6, yeah, the teacher says a sentence in which her learners use the tense incorrectly and asks them where the problem might be. We can again feed that forward. When we set up a speaking activity in which the learners discuss something, and the aim is to practice some grammar, we can put the learners in groups of 3 and nominate one person to be the listener. And then this person should be listening for specific examples of this piece of grammar which they hear. And they can make little notes, and then later on they can share those notes with their group to actually show what happened. And this way, they're also focusing on the mistakes. And it's particularly beneficial for them because they learn to hear the way the teacher hears. But it's also beneficial for the other people who are speaking because they can get immediate feedback on what just happened. And it's always a good idea to anticipate what might happen. So say, if we know that our learners have a constant problem with third person S, we can simply have a little corner on our board where we write S and just before setting up an activity say, pay particular attention to this form. And then the learners, when they look into that corner of the board, they immediately see, they have this cognitive anchor of using the third person S correctly. And finally, the thing I wanted to mention is the feedback being constructive and feedback being deconstructive or counterproductive. And I want to comment on this with one of my favorite pieces of art. And you can Google that later. That's Martin Firel, who has lots of different interesting things. But the comment is, we navigate our whole lives using words. And if we change and improve the words, I believe we can change and improve life. And as I said, feedback is everywhere, and the things we say have direct impact on our biology. And I personally believe that it's very important to be very careful about the words we choose. And I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of feedback, and I'd like us to think about the cases in which this feedback would be appropriate. So for instance, this phrase, okay, so you didn't do as well as you wanted to. Let's look at this as an opportunity to learn. Isn't exactly very positive. It's basically saying you didn't do well. But here, we can use it to actually motivate the learners. When? What task should it be? So imagine the learner I mentioned earlier, pre-intermediate level learner, who hands in an essay, a piece of an essay, with a lot of mistakes in third conditional, mixed conditional, which they attempt at, future forms, a mixture of future forms. And they might not know some of those, or they might already know some of those, but they're just experimenting. And this particular sentence is incredibly helpful when we give feedback on a task which is slightly higher than the cognitive level of the student at this very moment. So this kind of feedback which is not very positive, which says you didn't do very well, but let's look at this as an opportunity to learn, is very appropriate when the task is particularly difficult. And so let's keep this in mind, and let's look at 3 other examples and think about when we can use those. So here they are. And if we see, here are some strategies to figure this out. Is another thing which is not particularly positive. It basically says, you need more help. And that's another example of the feedback we can give on a task that's difficult and where the learners are struggling. And down there you can see a link, and that's a link to a lovely handout where you will see lots of other sentences which are which are all used to give feedback on different things. So like the first two here in my example are the sentences which we would say in response to a very difficult task where the learners struggle. And this way they won't be demotivated, because it wouldn't be very fair to say, okay, you did well here. Obviously they didn't. They made a lot of mistakes. And we want our feedback to still be valuable to the learners. I often give this example of a class in which a teacher shows a picture of a famous actor, say Brad Pitt, and says, "Who is this person?" And the students happily shout out, "Oh, Brad Pitt, Brad Pitt!" And you say, "Yes, great, excellent." What's great about it? It's simply knowing a face, which has nothing to do with the English language teaching. So when we say yes, great, in response to that thing, how valuable is our grade when we say it in response to a well-written essay? So again, let's be careful about the choice of words. And if we look at the third example on the slide, your hard work is clearly evident in your project or your essay. This is where we say, okay, you've made some mistakes, that's fine, but you're learning, and we see that you're learning. And if we combine the two, if we say your hard work is clearly evident in this project, and here are some more strategies to figure this out, this doesn't sound that negative. So that's what we can do. And there's this fourth example, which I find particularly interesting, where we say you're ready for something more difficult. And this is a tricky piece of feedback, because here we're basically saying you didn't really choose something that's at your level. Here we're saying, hey, my dear, you chose a task that's easy. You can do a lot better. And in a lot of cases, the students do that. They choose a simpler task, and they don't want to experiment with the language. And we really want to encourage them to do that. And on the handout down there, you will see more examples of how we can do that, because I think it's a great area, and we need to pay a lot of attention to it. I'm sure you've heard of the mindset and the two mindsets, being fixed mindset and growth mindset, where fixed mindset is, I believe this is how I can do it, and I believe I cannot swim or whatever. And the growth mindset being, I believe I cannot do it yet. And there's lovely TED Talks by Angela Lee Duckworth, and there's a book about mindset. So if you have the time and energy, it's definitely worth reading, and definitely an interesting read. So to sum up, and you'll get the links to those at the end of the webinar on my slides. So to summarize, a few final notes on feedback. It should be easily understandable. Our learners should understand what we mean. Is it feedback on content? Is it feedback on language? What are we doing there? Feedback should be constructive and motivating. It doesn't mean it should not be negative. It should be negative sometimes. If the task is too difficult and the learners are struggling, it's okay to say you're struggling, but to motivate them to struggle more, but to learn more. Feedback should be timely. Let's remember that the amount of hormones we receive depends on when we give feedback, or when we get feedback. Feedback should be memorable. Like I said, if we use this little corner of the board to point out the third person as, it creates a cognitive anchor. I still remember one of the teachers who I worked with ages ago, who had this little funny thing for third person as. So whenever the students made this mistake, he made a very funny face. and started running to the window and saying, "Oh, if I ever hear this mistake again, I'm just going to jump out of that window." And it's really funny, but after 3 or 4 times, our brain remembers that this is what's going to happen. And when you start to see, when the teacher starts that phase, you understand that you've made this mistake. And with time, it stays with us. We memorize that we shouldn't be saying this or that. Feedback should tell the learners how to do things correctly. So we should basically be feeding forward. We shouldn't just be saying, that's wrong, that's not how we should do it. But we should help them grow. We should tell them how to do things. And feedback should be accurate. Let's remember that there's a lot of there's a lot of fossilized errors which come from no feedback or wrong feedback. And finally, feedback should be empowering, because I want to go back to one slide here and show you my favorite quote again. We navigate our whole lives using words. And let's change and improve the words. And I believe we can change and improve life in learning and in all other aspects of life as well. The way we speak to our friends, our relatives, our family, if we're careful about our choice of words, things will be much better. And I think it's time for me to finish. And a lot of people are saying, I have to go, I have to go. And I'm sorry I'm taking up so much of your time. But I'm just going to pull up a slide with my contact details. And that's my email, kp@grade.ua. If you have any questions or any comments, or if you need anything, please do send me an email and I'll be very happy to respond to that. And you will also get the slides. Federica will talk about that in a minute, I think. But I just want to take this minute to say a huge thank you to everyone who joined this webinar today. Thanks for spending your time here with me. Thank you for finding this hour. And thank you for all the comments. I've been looking into the chat, trying to see what's happening there, and a lot of interesting discussions. And that's really motivating and inspiring for me as a trainer. So thank you very much. And also, thank you, Federica, for helping me out with this webinar. And a special thank you to Mike Riley, who invited me to do this webinar. And Federica, over to you, I think.
Thank you so much to you, Kateryna, for a great session. It was absolutely amazing, and I'm getting some great feedback already. Speaking of, you saw the comments in the chat box. People are absolutely enthusiastic. So thank you so much. I think if you have just one last minute, we got some questions from the live on Facebook, the live stream on Facebook. So a teacher asked, what are the So what are the implications in teaching of delayed or instant feedback?
Okay, so on CELTA we have specific rules for when we should do immediate or instant feedback and when we should do delayed feedback. And we say that if it's controlled practice, if it's drilling, we should do immediate feedback. If there is a communication breakdown, we should do immediate feedback. Or if it's something that's very, very common or fossilized, then definitely it could be an opportunity for immediate feedback. However, if it's a fluency activity, then we should do delayed feedback. But like I said in this webinar, it all depends. If our aim is to make our students actually use this language in this activity, even if it's for your practice, then we can break those rules. We have to be sensible there and break those rules and actually get the students to use this language.
Great, thank you. Another question that came up was, should there be different feedback when it comes to teaching different levels? So does feedback change if levels change?
Wow, that's a very good question. Well, feedback will definitely change as the level gets higher, because at lower levels, especially beginner levels, a lot of the feedback is nonverbal. And there's this danger that, we do quite a lot of that at lower levels, but don't do a lot of that at higher levels. I think, yes, feedback should change as the level gets higher, because this is our opportunity to give our students more. And if at lower levels we simply correct mistakes, At higher levels, we stretch or upgrade the student's language and give more synonyms and focus on something more sophisticated. So the answer is yes.
Great, thank you. I would say one last question and then we'll let you go because
Yeah.
Kateryna also delivered a session this morning, another session this morning.
Yeah.
So we've been really, really enjoying both sessions. The
I
question
have
is,
as well.
thank you, that's great. I'm sure people have been enjoying them as well. So the question is, should there be a balance between grades or marks and feedback, and how to find a good balance between these two factors?
Oh, again, a very good question. And I think, I mean, I don't think there is a definite answer there. Grades are good and grades are important, but I personally see them as a management tool, and not just classroom management, but learning management, and especially from the point of view of school management, where we take you to the next level if you pass this test. I think feedback should be happening all the time and should take a lot of different forms. Both formal and informal feedback should be happening there.